Good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Steiner, and I am here representing the Book Cellar. We're an independent bookstore in Chicago. We've been in the neighborhood for 16 years, but no matter where you're joining us from, you can still support us and support these fabulous authors by purchasing any of their books from our website, which is bookcellarinc.com. I'll drop it in the chat. You can reference it whenever you like. Thank you all so much for being here tonight for this celebration and discussion of Sharon's debut memoir, No Rules. Sharon will be in conversation with Rita Dragonette, whom you may know from the 14th of September, and Ilene English, whom you may know from Hippie Chick. Our event this evening will be moderated by Brooke Warner. The only housekeeping thing I'd like to mention is to request that all guests remain muted during the programming just to cut out some of the background noise. Feel free to leave any reactions or questions in the chat. That's enough from me. I'd like to turn things over to Brooke to get started. Brooke is the publisher of She Writes Press and Spark Press, the president of Warner Coaching, Inc., and the author of Write On Sisters, Greenlight Your Book, What's Your Book, and 3 books on memoir. Brooke is a TEDx speaker, weekly podcaster of Right Minded with Grant Faulkner, and the former executive editor of Seal Press. She also writes a monthly column for Publishers Weekly, so she knows a lot about the craft and she is very busy. All right, take it away, Brooke.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces. This is an honor, and I'm excited to be talking about this topic and celebrating Sharon tonight. And I love what she's put together. I mean, this is actually, everything about right now is unusual, as we know. I mean, the fact that we're doing this instead of meeting in a bookstore, and yet when Sharon contacted me to say, we're doing this panel event and in celebration of Sharon, our Ilene and Rita joining her tonight to have this conversation, I thought to myself, like, this is so perfect. You know, it's very emblematic of community. I think it is also it's an example of Sharon too, the way that she brings people together, and kind of in keeping with the whole hippie vibe. So with that in mind, I'm going to start by introducing Sharon Dukett. I'm going to read everybody's bios, and then we are doing something which is dividing this conversation into 3 topics that are kind of emblematic of these ladies' books. And we encourage you all to put your questions into the chat window, and then I can moderate those questions and we can talk about the topics, which are escaping to freedom, it often only looked like freedom, and transformation. So I'm looking forward to that. So let's start with Sharon, the lady of the hour. In addition to being an author, Sharon has previously been a cocktail waitress, computer programmer, project manager, and deputy director in government. In her memoir, No Rules, Sharon writes about her journey of awakening to feminism and her own strength during an early 1970s counterculture journey that began at the age of 16. No Rules was just named an award-winning finalist in the autobiography memoir category of the 2020 International Book Awards. And Sharon is wearing the dress that did you make it?
I made this dress, yes, when I was 16 years old.
16 years old, people. So
Yes.
She's going to show it off really quick, because not only is it gorgeous, but she's wearing the same size that she was when she was 16, which I think we should all take a moment.
It's stretchy.
I'm leaving now. Yeah.
Okay. So Rita Dragonette is a writer who, after spending nearly 25 years telling the stories of others as an award-winning public relations executive, has returned to her original creative path. Her multi-award-winning debut novel, The 14th of September, is based upon her personal experiences on campus during the Vietnam War. The story follows a young girl on a military scholarship who risks future and family to follow her conscience during 1969 and 1970, the most turbulent time of the war. So I love, hi Rita.
Hello.
And so
I
I love
my book, but I realized it's backwards. Yeah.
It actually comes up fine.
Does it? Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
for us, it's not backwards.
Oh, all right. Okay.
And I also like that we have 2 memoirists and 1 novelist tonight, because that also gives some different perspective and is an interesting conversation about craft and how we choose to tell our stories. And Ilene is the other memoirist. And Ilene was one of the early pioneers to San Francisco in the late 60s. Her memoir, Hippie Chick, is the story of her journey from lost child to strong, independent woman. Hippie Chick recently won the Independent Book Publishers Association Silver Award of Best Memoir of 2020. And she's a licensed psychotherapist, mother, and a grandmother. And you are wearing a necklace from the era.
No, I need this necklace. It's a pandemic power necklace.
Oh, it's a pandemic power necklace. Well, even better. In like 50 years from now, I'm going to have my pandemic wear and be reminiscing about right now. Okay, so let's start with transformation. So this topic is a huge topic, obviously, and we're going to get to hear, each of you has selected, sorry, not transformation. We're starting with escaping to freedom. Apologies. Escaping to freedom is the first topic. Okay. So we're talking about in these readings, and you're going to hear from each of them about questions of feeling trapped, looking ahead to a seemingly predetermined life to mirror that of their unhappy mothers, limited to the conventions of a previous time. I mean, as I said, Rita's book is a novel, and Ilene and Sharon have written memoirs. And so I think it's interesting to think about that in the context of the readings tonight. And also, hopefully, that will spark some questions as well. And this time, you know, the 60s and the early 70s, and what was going on in your minds and your experiences as you thought about this concept of escaping to freedom. And so with that parameter or container, I'm very excited to hear your readings. And I think we're starting with Sharon.
Yes. So I'm reading today from No Rules, my memoir. And I'm starting with the opening chapter, which you'll understand why I wore the dress. Okay. Chapter 1, January 1971, South Windsor, Connecticut. I slipped the floor-length dress I'd sewn from a purple Indian print bedspread over my head and pulled it down to cover the 2 pairs of long pants, 3 sweaters, and 4 pairs of underwear I'd put on moments before, then realized how huge my waist looked. If I didn't wear my coat to cover these clothes, my mother would realize something was wrong. I yanked my dress sleeves over all my other sleeves. If anything showed, I'd be screwed. While stuffing a pair of jeans and my fake suede jacket with a peace sign on the shoulder into a paper bag, I scanned the closet for my sandals. I'd need sandals in Southern California. I was certain it would be hot there, even in January. With my meager belongings stashed for my journey, I took a last brief look at my room, the room in which I'd spent 12 of my 16 years living in, and wondered how I could abandon all of my things. The FM radio that my parents had given me for Christmas 3 weeks earlier, the guitar I had begged for when I was 12, my notebooks full of poetry I'd written over the last 4 years. Above my twin-size bed was a poster I'd made with magic markers the previous spring, flowers and peace signs forming a border around large decorative letters that read, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." Don't get hung up on it, I coached myself. It's only stuff. I crammed my arms into the sleeves of my brown corduroy winter coat and could barely bend them. Grabbing the paper bag and my school books, I dashed toward the kitchen, knowing my mother was waiting there to say goodbye before I left for school. I took a deep breath. "You're wearing your new dress." She sounded suspicious. I avoided eye contact. "I didn't realize you'd finished making it." "Yeah, I finished it last night. I'm late for the bus. I have to go." I dove past her. "What's in the bag?" "Gym clothes," I shot back without turning around. "It's awful big for gym clothes. I've got to run, okay? Bye." I bolted out the side door and let it shut behind me, not looking back to see my mother for what might have been the last time in my life. But I couldn't think about that. If I did, I couldn't leave, and I had to leave. This was my only opportunity. I knew she was standing by the door, following me with her eyes, that worried frown cemented on her lined, sad face. While closing the chain link gate behind me at the end of our driveway, I recalled the dreams I'd had throughout my childhood, where I tried to escape through this gate. I was always running with legs of lead that made me move in slow motion, trying desperately to run faster as long arms reached out to drag me back. I never knew what I was running from in those dreams, but I always awoke before escaping. I couldn't let that happen now. Dirty snow lined the road, remnants of yesterday's storm. I snickered at it. Sunny California, here I come, I thought. Only one last ride on the school bus. My heart raced, making me almost dizzy. That's the end of the first scene in chapter 1. In the stress?
Thank you, Sharon. Awesome. Let's see, are we in order, Rita?
Do we have any discussion around that one, or you want me to just?
I think you will each read and then we'll have questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the section that I'm focusing on really is the fact that we all escaped from freedom to freedom, but there were sobering times that happened that made us realize that perhaps it only looked like freedom and there was disillusionment ahead. And it had to do with many topics, but I'm going to be dealing with one of them because one of the freedoms we were escaping to was political freedom and the freedom to have a point of view that was different from our World War II era parents. And in 1969, which was my experience and also the setting for my novel, the political experience was ending the Vietnam War. And the significant thing about that, beyond everything you've known about the war, is that that was supposed to be emblematic of this new world that was going to be so equitable that we were going to change into. Remember, we were all going to change the world. And it was going to be totally equal, men and women together, equally valued. And it was exciting and it was thrilling. And we really did feel we were all together until we weren't. And very often we would stumble up onto an obstacle that everyone who's reading here tonight has run into before during that time frame. And it would come out of nowhere and you'd think everything is okay. And suddenly some man would come in and totally marginalize you. And you would realize that no matter what was said and no matter what your impression was, it was still a world of men. Now, to illustrate that, I'm going to dive right in the middle of a pretty tough scene from my novel. And it's going to tell you what that worked out like in a human capacity. The scene opens, it actually takes place the night before the first draft lottery. And there's a group of friends, men and women, and they're very tight. They love each other. But that night, everybody is scared to death and there's lots of questions. And Vita, one of the female characters, has just finished reading a newspaper article telling them all about how the lottery is going to work. But in a, she thinks, compassionate attempt to lighten up the tension, she has presented this in a very colorful way. And she's had a lot of sarcastic asides. And the rest of the scene that I'll read now will tell you just how that went over. I just want to know if my student deferment is still in effect, Howie said. Could you read that part again? Let me find it, Vita said, scanning the article. Wait, here's something really interesting. Would you just tell Howie what he wants to know and not what you think is interesting, David said. I understand, Vita said. I'm getting to it. No, you don't understand. You need to get to it now. This is life and death shit. Don't put all that cutesy stuff into it. They all turned to David, shocked. Jesus, they're drawing lots, he said. The lower your number, the sooner you die. It's that simple. How many times do you have to hear it? Give it to me. I'll answer your question. Howie. He grabbed the newspaper out of Vita's hands. Full-time college students are eligible for deferments to graduation if their records are satisfactory. There, was that so hard?
Hi, Jane. Your name didn't pop up. No, but my phone pronounced your name, so.
Leah, can you mute people? People, if you're talking in the program, so just as a note, Rita's in the middle of
Well, I'm on a Zoom meeting, but you know what?
Sorry.
Evelyn.
Okay. There we go. Continue, Rita. Sorry about that.
Okay, I hope we remember where we were. Okay, he's just grabbed the newspaper back. There, was that so hard? He threw the paper back at Vita. They glared at each other. What? You don't understand. Women just don't get it. That's all there is to it. Am I wrong? He looked at Achilles and Will for approval. Excuse me, Vita said. I've been running anti-war activity since high school, and you're saying I don't understand? It doesn't have anything to do with that, David said. It's not your fault. You're a chick. Vita stood up, and Judy thought she was going to slap him. What the hell are you talking about, she said. What I'm talking about is, look, just don't say you understand, okay? He pointed his cigarette toward her, and then to Judy and Romo and Marcia. Don't ever say you understand. You might think you do, but you can't. Who do you think you are, Vita said. I'm a guy who's going to get a number tomorrow, and that number will determine if I'm going to live or die. Something like that happening in your life soon? Vita sat down. I'm so sick of all this empathy, David said. Remember, we're the ones who might get killed. We're the ones who are going to have to decide if we can pull that trigger. There is nothing in the entire experience of your sex that can prepare you for how to understand what that feels like. He looked around the room. Everyone except Vita was looking down. All right, so I'm an ass. I can't help it. I can take anything, but I can't take a woman telling me she understands. Vita looked at him with pure fury. You are an ass, she said, but I'm going to chalk it up to lottery nerves. She picked up her jacket. Come on, girls. They need to be alone. We may not understand, but we get it. So that's an example of how quickly things could turn when you think you're all together and suddenly, boom, and it happens all the time. And somebody's raising up their thumb like they know it happens all the time. So that was a huge obstacle to the freedom that we had. And every time we went into any environment and it was all about sex, drugs, rock and roll, possibilities, new passions, whatever, it was the aura of the fact that it was still a man's world.
Thank you.
Welcome to the 60s, yeah.
And beyond, right. All right, thank you. Yeah, good. I'm getting some claps. I agree. So we're, because we have these three topics, I guess we're gonna front load the readings, Ilene, and just do your reading, which is your reading on transformation.
Hey, let me just give a little bit of context that my book is earlier than these other two books. I was really there in the early 60s. It was before there was any racial unrest. It was my experience that there was ease between blacks and whites. It was before things became politicized. I remember it as a time of youthful idealism and hopefulness. We actually thought we could change the world with love. I mean, all you had to do was be peaceful. My transformation really began with losing my mother. When I was a rebellious teenager, I was rebelling against my mother, and then I found her dead in the toilet. And that was the beginning of transformation for me. But this part I'm going to read is about divorce and my husband walking out of the house is for the last time. Larry was gone, but his distinctive odor lingered on, a familiar musty smell that gave me the sense that he was still near. I wandered the house like a ghost, first to the baby's room where my girl slept peacefully, unaware that her lives were forever changed. I gazed at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. What happened? What did I do wrong? I asked myself as tears streamed down my face, suddenly realizing I was
Kill yourself, you fucking old hag. Kill yourself. Fucking fag. Don't we please, dude? Oh, fuck my
protected us from danger, but like most women, I was conditioned to believe that as long as there was a man around, I was safe. I then crawled into what for 7 years had been our marriage bed. Praying to a God that I barely believed in, I cried myself to sleep. Sarah Grace was 18 months old when Larry left. I went from a professor's wife to a welfare mother, from being a family to a single mom. For 7 years, Larry had been the one person I counted on in this world. I somehow thought that if I gave up everything for him, he would love me forever. And over, I gave up what I thought I wanted in exchange for the closest thing I knew to a healthy relationship. Somehow I had good instincts to want something healthy, but sadly, I didn't know what healthy was. It's not a healthy relationship if one person feels they have to give up their dreams in order to be loved. Separating from Larry felt like a death. It was unimaginable to me that this could happen. That's how connected I thought we were. What took me a while to realize was that I was repeatedly trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Welfare was a godsend. That plus child support and food stamps got us through. I promised myself that I would not be on the dole forever. Larry's child support was $75 a month, given grudgingly. He was convinced that his contribution was somehow not being used to support his child, but rather being used to support me, as if my well-being didn't matter. I always knew that Larry had issues around money. He was never a generous guy, keeping track of every penny, mostly I think because he hated to work. But when his distrust was directed at me, I was deeply offended. The blessing in disguise was that his attitude caused me to finally begin to pay attention. For the first time ever, I realized that Larry no longer had my best interests at heart. Though I loved riding my bike with Sarah Grace's shotgun in the baby seat, the cold gray drizzle that is winter in Eugene made bicycling much of the year impractical. No, now that I was on my own, I needed a car. The problem was I didn't know how I would pay for one. I spent weeks looking through the newspaper and making calls until I found a 1963 VW Bug.
No.
A lot of people tonight. Yeah, and then to eject people. We need to eject Elaine Miller.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'd got a VW Bug. There was a kind soul let me pay it off over time. The first thing I did was remove the back seat and replace it with a portable crib. A perfect fit. Sarah Grace now had a home on the road, complete with her precious unicorn Lovey and Blanky and her ubiquitous baby bottle of orange juice. She could happily nap or play as I tootled along. Ah, the days before car seats. I'd just toss her in and off we'd go. Where to? Why, Goodwill, of course, the go-to place for those always much needed baby clothes. Mama, mama, itsy bitsy spider. Agenda halted. Okay, we can sing our favorite song here in front of the Goodwill. My girl loved when we walked our fingers up the water spout and then the way our fingers danced like rain as we sang, down comes the rain and washed the spider out. And she would laugh and say, again, mama, and we would sing it all again. What a light this child, curly blonde ringlets like an aura of sunshine around her sweet face. How could I feel anything but joy? In those moments, I knew that I was the lucky one and she was the prize.
Thank you.
Silent copy.
All right, well, that's fun, you guys. I've been Zooming for months and keep hearing about Zoom bombs, and so now we know what those feel like. Julia is not going to let anyone else in at this point, which I think is a good decision since we're halfway through. And thanks everybody for being, hanging in. And those were lovely readings. So at this point, we're going to talk about these different topics. I mean, certainly you're not limited to talking about the 3 topics that the authors have identified tonight, which are escaping to freedom. It often only looked like freedom and transformation, but I have some questions in each of these categories, and we're gonna just move into a Q&A, and it is always nice to hear from the audience, and it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. So if you want to pop a question into the chat window, just know that I'll see it and I'll moderate those. So why don't we go to escaping to freedom. I mean, I think it's interesting that each of these stories touches upon feelings of feeling trapped. And Ilene, you spoke to this idea of it being a freeing time, a hopeful time, and then there's that juxtaposition and paradox of it also not being that. And so I thought we might just talk about what this era really felt like, and especially because you've all written from a vantage point of looking back from a number of decades. So Sharon, maybe we can start with you and talk about, what did it feel like, or, what does it feel like when you look at it from the lens of now?
Okay, well, at the time, basically what was going on was that I felt that I needed to escape from the rules that my parents had imposed upon me, because I believe that a life without those rules would bring me freedom and happiness. My mother was a very unhappy person, and she was lonely. She was from England, and she had moved here after the war, after marrying my father, who she hardly knew. And she envisioned that she would raise us as though she was living in England. And as a result of that, we kind of felt like we were outsiders, because we weren't allowed to do the things that the other children in our neighborhood were able to do. And in addition to that, my parents felt that that there was they didn't have very much money. And so the idea of sending me to college was something that they couldn't afford. But beyond that, they also didn't feel it was worth even discussing finding some way around that. In my book, I talk about how I made suggestions that, well, maybe I could work my way through college. And they said, well, you'll never get a scholarship because you're not, you have one grade that's not doing well. And their idea of what a woman should do is to follow the same path that my mother had followed, which was, get a job, get married, live at home, and, have a job as a secretary or something like that. That's what women do. And there was no point in attempting to send a girl to college, because that was just a waste, because girls just went to college to find husbands. And so when I looked at that future, it was a future that to me just felt as though it wasn't a future. It was a confining future that I didn't want to face. So as a result of that, I made the decision to make my own future.
Thank you. There are so many questions. Do you want to move on to other questions and then kind of alternate, or do one of you want to pick up the thread of that question?
I'd like to pick up the thread. I don't mean to keep it just to the speakers, but I also think that, and anyone who went through it will remember this, is that time frame, we were crashing into two worlds. There was the world that had survived World War II, and they went through the very placid 50s, and suddenly all of this stuff is exploding and everything can be changed. And we were really the first generation to be raised to follow passion as opposed to just make a living. And it was so exciting. And even if you were in these families that were still very traditional, you were hearing all this stuff. I mean, I grew up in Chicago. The Democratic Convention happened here in the summer while I was in high school, and it had terrible pictures all over television, but I couldn't wait to get involved in it because they were all free, and look at all the things that were happening. And it was early feminism and civil rights, and we really did feel like we could change the world. You couldn't wait to get out into it. And here's your cautious parents going, now wait a minute, you have to take care of yourself. I had the same thing Sharon did. There was no money. If there was, it would have gone to the boy. But, and my mother wanted me to go ahead and do this, but I realized later that I had a failure of imagination, just like she did, ended up on the same path she was going to. So it was teenage rebellion. I didn't want to do what my mother did, but I wanted like crazy to get involved in this world out there. And so it was, the push and the pull was so much different than in other time frames.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, and Ilene, what was the draw for you when you sat down to write a memoir? I'm guessing that this was just an obvious choice of when you would write about.
Well, I knew it was an exciting time, and I had a story that wanted to come out, so it was a no-brainer. I wasn't really going off to be a hippie. There were no hippies yet. After my mother died, I was living alone with a very difficult father. All my older siblings had already left, and I was alone with him, and he was trying to make me into what my mother did, to cook and clean for him. And he said inappropriate things to me, like, "Why do all the boys like you? You're like a dog in heat." And who says that to their daughter? And he didn't trust me, and he was convinced that I wasn't good. And I knew I needed to get away from him. Fortunately, I had an older sister who believed that too, and sent me a plane ticket to come to California once I graduated high school. That I wound up in the Haight was nothing more than chance. My brother-in-law owned a building there and allowed me to live rent-free. The Haight was just a typical working class neighborhood. It was nothing unusual in 1963. I just happened to watch the whole thing unfold right before my eyes. And of course, enthusiastically got involved.
And people my age just idolized people like her. We all wanted to do that. Go to the Fillmore and get involved with drugs and do all this. And the Haight was just amazing. And then you tell me it was just like a regular neighborhood.
The hub.
Yes.
That's really cool. Well, I like this question coming from Linda about what women were your role models in your quest for freedom?
Is that a question to the speakers?
I would love to know from each of you. Yeah, I mean, one that stands out. I mean, I'm just thinking about these times, you know, the early 60s for Ilene, the late 60s, and Sharon's story takes place mainly in the 70s. You know, were there people that you thought, like, I can do this because she is?
My first introduction was Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique. That book, you know, really changed my head around. And of course, Gloria Steinem was around and a model for us as well.
Yeah,
Gloria Steinem came to our campus, and it's the first time that she said, that I heard her say that God was a woman.
Was that?
That she called God her. And it was just stunning, you know. It was because we didn't have a whole lot of role models. My role models were people like Ilene. They were like, oh, they went out to the Haight. Or people like Janis Joplin before she hit the drugs really hard. You know, there were a lot of music people that were our idols, but then somebody like Steinem shows up and says that on campus. Yeah. You know, that God is a her.
Yeah, I think mostly men were the models, not women. Early. Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I can't think of a woman before I left. There isn't one that comes to mind other than sort of generic models or musicians. I mean, there were musicians that were models, but people like Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane and who we listened to. But not people that I really knew much about. But later on, as I came to learn more about feminism and so forth, you know, I would have to say the same thing. You know, Betty Friedan and you know Gloria Steinem and you know others that had books out that I read were all those that kind of drew me into the feminism.
Well, and Sharon, I think it's interesting that your book, I mean, if you read all of these in order, you have like a trajectory of a decade, you know, and so I hear Rita saying, you know, oh, I people like Ilene were my role models, and I'm imagining from, you know, from your vantage point being, you know, 15 and 16 in the early 70s, like whatever they were involved in, like that was your role model. And so I wonder if you could say a word about, you know, what about the lives of, you know, what they were doing made you want to hit the road and go do that?
Well, I mean, it seemed like everyone was, you know, really had all this incredible freedom, and I imagined that there would be, you know, all this love and peace, and everybody would be, you know, it'd be a community, and in some ways it was. There were times when it was, but there was a lot of times when it wasn't as well. So you know, in that respect, I think I was kind of, you know, had this naive fantasy that all I had to do was find the hippies and you know, life would be wonderful. I'd be in utopia, and you know, we'd all smoke pot together and live happily ever after. So in that respect, you know, that got dashed pretty quickly as I met people that didn't quite fit into that that mode. And plus we had gone to Southern California versus San Francisco, which is, you know, a lot of things were going on in San Francisco. But by that time, even, you know, people were saying Haight-Ashbury wasn't a great place to go necessarily because, you know, that was in 1971. And I think, you know, things, yeah, so things were kind of changing up there. So we had gone to Southern California because that was always a fantasy of my sister and I always had this fantasy about, you know, going to Southern California and living on a beach. So we ended up in Venice Beach, and there were plenty of hippies there.
Well, and you all had harrowing experiences as well. I mean, these are not just like, oh, yay, you know, peace and love, and that's all that happened. You know, I mean, there's a lot of drama and trauma. And so, you know, I'm just curious from the vantage point of today, how do you make sense of your experiences, you know, and looking back, do you say like, oh my gosh, we were crazy to have done that? Or do you think like I would have done it, you know, and gone even harder?
I know. I mean, I had to do that. That's that much I know for me. If I had stayed where I was, I just don't know what would have happened. I mean, maybe, you know, maybe I would have figured something out, but I think I would have just been a very, very unhappy person and probably married the first man who came along who wanted to get married and you know, and lived an unhappy life and all that kind of thing. So, you know, as a result of doing the things I did, I certainly learned a lot more about trusting people or not trusting people. I mean, I learned how to, you know, get over that blind trust of anyone. And I also, I think for me, there was also the factor of spirituality. Like I was raised Catholic, and I had become an atheist by the time I left home. So I was exposed to a whole lot of, you know, the whole New Age thing was starting, and there was a lot of new kind of spiritual activity and experimentation in that. And I was drawn towards that as well. And looked at that part of my life. So that was something else that I think made a difference to me. But in the long term, what really mattered was, as a result of all of this, kind of discovering my inner strength as a woman, and recognizing how, you know, rules that were made for women were what was keeping me down, what was preventing me from moving forward. And I had to get beyond that and not listen to those rules anymore.
Thus the title of your book.
Yeah,
Yes.
Exactly.
Good branding, Sharon.
I think this is a great question for everybody that's posed by Carolyn. You've each beautifully captured the history that many of us lived through. What do you want younger generations to get out of your book?
Well, I had the college experience, which was a little different, and it was activism. I'm being on college campus in 69 and 70. It was between the first draft lottery and Kent State. And Corey knows all about Kent State, but it was like one continuous protest movement. You know, we just went from one thing to another, and no schoolwork got done, you know, but the whole idea that we had to wash these old things away and come up with new things is a belief that goes into you. I personally think that the character of our generation was formed in the 6 months between the first draft lottery and Kent State, because that was the drive to actually envision the fact that you could change things. Now, our generation did a lot of good things. We didn't finish everything, but we were the first ones to push it that far. And when I see all the activism today, I actually wrote a piece because in Chicago, I got stuck in the first riot of the Black Lives Matter in Chicago when they broke all the glass. And all I could think of was, oh my God, this is exactly the same feeling. There's so much pent up rage that something is going to happen. Glass will break, and the minute the glass breaks, people are going to splinter and stop listening. And so a lot of that is so tied. I feel like I'm living the hamster wheel of history right now. Everything that's going on is so parallel to what was happening then. And those are some of the same issues that we were working on at the time too, and it just tells you how long it takes to make change and how easy it is to put things under the carpet.
Yeah, I've been very curious to read personal stories from people who went through the 60s, and I think particularly that era, like the 68, 69. And Sharon, I mean, when you showed up on the West Coast, it was the 70s. And I mean, did you have a sense that things had changed, or did you feel like you were still in the middle of change?
Well, the war was still going on when I was there, so people, I met veterans, I met a veteran who had just come back from the war and, heard a different side from what I was used to listening to on the news, a whole different perspective of what was going on over there. And the moratoriums were kind of in full swing at that point. There was a huge, like the biggest one that had ever happened took place in San Francisco, and we drove up there, and for various reasons that you'll discover in the book, never actually got to the event. But we had made an attempt to do that, and been there the night before, walking around downtown San Francisco, connecting with people and figuring out where we were going to sleep, and then driving over the mountain into Mount Tamalpais and sleeping up on the mountain. But but a lot of that was still happening because the war was still on. Everything was continuing. Nixon was still president, although that during that later on in my book is the time frame when that all starts to unravel. So.
Yeah, interesting. Well, and how about you, Ilene? Because you were kind of on the front end of it. I mean, it sounds like when you got there, you said it was a working class neighborhood and you didn't have a sense of it. So when did it shift?
Well, there's so much to say. I really embraced the excitement of the times. There was things like people giving out sugar cubes of LSD, to people walking by in the park, and how I popped one in my mouth. And, I was willing to do anything and everything because that's what was happening. And we were all doing it. And, I think it was probably really dangerous, but I had no clue of any danger at all. I would take anything and smoke anything and ingest anything. And there was no AIDS yet. The worst thing that could happen to you was getting pregnant. But I think that what I want women to get from the story is how I abandoned myself over and over again for men to feel loved, and thinking that I needed a man to feel whole. And through the book, I learned to love myself, and that's a big effort, and I'm still working on that effort. And I think that all the drugs that I did really held me back, that when I finally did get my shit together, I was a lot older than everybody else. I was the oldest one in my graduate school class, and I feel like I've been playing catch up my whole life because I wasted a whole bunch of time. And also how important it is to reach out for help. I was clueless about how to deal with my problems. There was no one to talk to, and there just wasn't the resources there are today. And so I think it's just so important to reach out for help. And also the other thing is to help other people. My sister changed my life by sending me a plane ticket. And I think that is so important that one person can really change your life. And I guess I want that message to be out there.
And I have to ask, is that why you became a therapist?
Is that why I became a therapist? Yeah, I had a sister who was, I was with her while she was dying, and I couldn't really talk to her about it because I was too scared and I didn't know how to talk about death. And I became someone who people could talk to, and after she died, yeah.
Because I do think the things we went to then were very instrumental in what we ended up becoming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I was on a track to become an Army nurse of all things in the middle of a war, and going through all these years made me realize not only that that was not the place for my conscience or my interests, but that I learned in all the anti-war stuff I was a good communicator. You know, that I was somebody that I just didn't want to be a follower in this big group marching on Washington. I wanted to be the one that was figuring out what the agenda was. And it taught me a lot about what I could do even when I didn't have confidence. And I ended up going into, of all things, a business career, but it was around communications. And I learned all that in those years. I learned my personal experience with drugs was, it just was boring. I was one of those people that kept thinking about all the things I could do when I came down again. You know? So I also learned that I had to be active and I needed a purpose and I wanted accountability, and all of those things came out of those alternative lifestyle things, because that's what my alternative was to the military. And I got confidence to sort of just have more imagination about where I could go. And I don't know that that would have happened if I had stayed in the Army. I shudder to think being a communications officer in the Army would have been like during the Vietnam years. And if I had stayed a nurse, I would have gone to Vietnam.
For me, I felt that one of the important things that came out of that time for me was learning not to be afraid to take a chance on something, because I tried a lot of different things. Some of them didn't go so well. Some of them went better. And I learned just to realize that it was okay to experiment and go into things that I knew nothing about, and I could learn, and I didn't have to be afraid of trying that. So I kind of grew up in a household where I was always told, don't do this, don't do that, this might happen, that might happen. Some of that came in useful later on in my life when I was a project manager and I had to think of risks. I was very good at thinking of risks. But so that was part of what I wanted my book to say. But the other part I wanted my book to say was for young women, to recognize, you know, what women during the second wave feminism went through and how life changed for them, and not to take for granted the freedoms and the abilities that they have today, so that they kind of realize that it's not a guaranteed thing, which of course more people are seeing now with what's been going on in the last couple of years. But
thank you all so much. And yeah, I mean, so much is at stake right now, and I think it's impossible not to look at the parallels. I thought it would be fun though to pivot in the last question, maybe to talk about writing. It's a book event after all. And Corey asked a great question. All of these readings have such wonderful, rich details. As you write from personal experiences, how do you craft these passages and what memories evoke them? And so I thought if we could just hear from each of you about the experience of craft and writing would be, I think a lot of people on this call, I know a lot of people on are writers themselves.
I can
go ahead, Ilene.
Yeah. Now that I spoke up, what do I want to say? I had a hard time writing this book with anybody else around. I needed to be alone because I needed to drop down and actually feel some really deep feelings that had been like moving around inside me for so long. And in the writing of it, I was sobbing a lot of time and, you know, just feeling like reliving it again, what I had gone through, and you know, writing that down. I had journals that I had kept, which helped refresh details, but really it was in the present time of going back and feeling it again, where I really did most of the writing. And yeah, it was very, very painful. It was not an easy process. And people say, what's your next project? Well, it's definitely not a memoir.
Well, even if you tried to fictionalize it too, like my choice was, is this going to be a memoir? Is this going to be a novel? But, you know, in my case, real life doesn't arrange itself in a nice narrative arc. And I was able to put a nice narrative arc into that. But like you, Eileen, there were chapters that I had to write about my fictional mother. And I remember being at Ragdale, which was a writing retreat, and I just didn't want to go back up into my room because that was the day I decided I would have to write the scene. And I did not want to conjure her back up again. But if you go through the times yourself, like people always ask me what kind of research I did, I carried those voices with me. I carried those smells. I mean, I know what that first bit of sulfur is when you hit that, you know, that first cigarette and that first joint and all those things. It was all still there because it was such a pivotal time in my life. I don't know if I could drop into any other place in my life and feel that, but this was a transformative time. I mean, nobody was doing the kinds of things that we were doing. And the revelations that you did, and you just carry it with you the whole time. And I fictionalized it to put in all the missing pieces, you know, because terrible things could happen in fiction that didn't necessarily happen in real life, and make the story better, you know. So that was the way we did it. But there would be times that, like certain characters, there's a bad boy in there that my character falls in love with. We've all fallen in love with bad boys, right? And people would ask, why would Judy stay with the bad boy? Well, because I could get that intrigue in there, and I knew that the charisma and the repellent part of him could be brought together. I tried to make him more understanding and reasonable, and he just wouldn't be that way. So he just had to be bad all the way through. And that was a writing thing. It's like some characters refuse to be nicer, right?
Yeah.
So that was a big experience for me. I had to, like, just that whole fantasy that people say the characters will take over. It happened to me one afternoon in Ragdale, and it was like, okay, go, just go.
Thanks, Rita. How about you, Sharon?
For me, as far as the memories, well, I had started writing a lot of this quite a number of years ago when more of this stuff was fresh in my mind. But even then, I was worried that I didn't remember a lot of stuff. But once I started writing it and getting deeply into it, it would all start rushing at me, particularly if, and sometimes I would play music if I'm writing about a certain era and I remembered what kind of music I was listening to at the time. And so if I played that music, the music would invoke all kinds of memories. And one example I can think of, actually this wasn't related to music, but I was trying to write about I was writing this scene about British Columbia where we're in this town and we're we're hitchhiking and it's very, very hot. And my boyfriend who's with me, that he had gotten something in his eye, and you know, I remembered vividly that whole scene. And then there was a driver who came along in a pickup truck to pick us up, which triggered a whole lot of things that happened. And as I was writing about opening the door and getting into the truck, I actually in my mind saw him turn and he was wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt. And then I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. He was wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt. And I actually saw it in my mind as I was writing it. So some of these details are they're all in there. They're all in here, but you just got to pull them out and find them. So that's, and the more you write, the more that those details will come to you.
I do have to say that any of the three of us could also write a whole book about hitchhiking. And at the bottom, it would say, never do this. Never,
Maybe that's
ever do
your
this.
next anthology, hitchhiking stories.
That's
Oh,
not
I
a
had
bad
fun
idea.
hitchhiking.
Not a bad idea.
I had
Hitchhiking.
a ball hitchhiking. I had some wonderful experiences hitchhiking.
And I was almost killed
I
several
never,
times.
I
So
never
there you
felt
go.
afraid hitchhiking. I didn't feel afraid. I don't know if I was stupid, but I think it was safer time.
It was a safer time.
Safer time, indeed. I don't think I would be recommending any 16-year-olds today to be hitchhiking across the country.
Anyone, no one should hitchhike.
Well, this has been so interesting. Thank you. And I think Julia has some closing words about the books. And I just want to say this is amazing that we get to congregate like this, and especially in being supported by an independent bookstore. I think it goes without saying that these are very trying times for indie publishing in particular. And so if you can support them tonight, that would be wonderful. If you go back to the top, the very first URL that Julia posted was bookcellarinc.com. If you already have all 3 of the books, which I imagine you don't, buy anything from bookcellarinc.com. And I have been experimenting buying from different bookstores around the country, which has been really interesting to watch how quick and slow they are. Some of them are very slow and some of them are very fast, but let's not buy from Amazon. Please buy from your indie bookstores, and really would love to have some closing words from Julia about Bookseller Inc. And if you have your books, ladies, hold them up. And then that also makes it easier for people to type your titles into their browsers.
Here we go, the 14th of September. And the bookseller supplied all my books for my launch. Just saying. Yeah, there you go.
It's true. I think to piggyback off what Brooke is saying, it's a real symbiotic relationship that indie bookstores have with indie publishers, and we've got to keep being there for each other and making space for each other. So if you feel, if you like what you heard tonight and want to read more, we've got all of these books on the shelves right now. Please give us a visit at bookcellarinc.com. I can type it up because it's a pun, it's cellar like wine cellar. I'm so glad that you all came tonight. Thank you to our authors and our moderator for being here, and thank you for putting up with the chaos and sticking around to hear these stories.
And I hate to sound like a political candidate, but you can find out more about me on Rita Dragonette.com.
I love that. Who else has websites?
I do. It's SharonDukett.com.
Oh, these are so hard to remember.
Mine is hippiechickmemoir.com.
There you go.
Perfect. So beautiful to see so many faces and other She Writes authors. Thank you for supporting one another. It's one of the most amazing things about our community. So kisses to all of you, and congratulations, Sharon.
Yes.
Yes, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. And thank you, Brooke, for hosting, and Julia for moderating, and Julia, thank you very much for hosting our event tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations.
Okay.
Keep those bombs out of that. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I guess I can. See how much bigger my face gets when there's less things going on? I look more like a corpse. Oh. Okay, this was great. Julia, you all set?
Thank you, Julia. You did a beautiful job of getting rid of those guys.
Yeah, well, nothing I love more than blocking right-wing trolls, so happy to
Has
help.
that happened to you before? I've never seen it before.
It happened once, and we thought it was because it was like for a book about gaming, and we thought it just might have drawn like some of the more unsavory characters in that community. But now that it's happened again, I've already come up with a plan to reconfigure.
Yeah,
our
and you
events
saw the
like
second one
this.
that was writing offensive things, even though they
Yeah.
weren't coming out. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
just like, wow, I haven't
Yeah.
seen that before. Okay, well, hopefully everyone will buy all 3 of our books from
Yeah, I hope so.
and you'll let us know. Okay,
Yes.
thanks so much.
Bye,
Yeah.
Well, it was great to see you in person, and I want to know how much that necklace weighs.
It's not heavy.
Really?
It's
Oh,
not
God,
heavy.
it looks heavy. It's just fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, have a good night.
Good night. I'm having a glass of wine after this. I deserve it. Everyone does.
I'll toast to you.